They called him the Moses of Kentucky. But what history books won't tell you is that Elijah Anderson was more than just a conductor on the Underground Railroad. He was a black man, born into slavery, who somehow built one of the most sophisticated escape networks in American history, moving over 1,000 people to freedom before his mysterious death in a Kentucky prison in 1857. The records say he died of natural causes at 47, but 3 guards who saw his final hours refused to speak of what they witnessed. And the prison warden ordered Anderson's body buried in an unmarked grave within 6 hours of his death, no autopsy, no family notified, no public record of where he was laid to rest. For more than a century and a half, Anderson's story has been deliberately obscured, his methods kept secret, and the truth of his final days hidden behind layers of destroyed documents and sealed testimonies. What you're about to hear is the result of years of research into fragmented court records, private letters, and testimonies never meant to see the light of day. A story of courage, deception, and a network so intricate that even today historians cannot fully explain how one man achieved what entire abolitionist organizations struggled to accomplish. Before we continue with the story of Elijah Anderson, if you're fascinated by untold American histories and dark mysteries from our past, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss stories like this. I'd love to know, leave a comment telling me what state or city you're listening from. Now, let's uncover the truth about the men they tried to erase from history. The story of Elijah Anderson begins not with his heroism, but with a mystery surrounding even his birth. A mystery that would define all that followed. Madison, Indiana, in the 1830s was a river town caught between 2 worlds. Situated on the northern bank of the Ohio River, it was a crucial port where Kentucky tobacco and hemp crossed into free territory, where southern plantation owners did business with northern merchants, and where the invisible line between slavery and freedom was as real as the muddy water dividing the states. The town's population of nearly 3,000 included German immigrants fleeing European upheaval, Irish laborers working the docks, Quaker families whose quiet abolitionism simmered beneath polite society, and a small but growing community of free black residents living under the constant threat of kidnapping and re-enslavement. The Anderson family had arrived in Madison around 1835, though the circumstances of their arrival stayed deliberately vague in the sparse records that mention them. Elijah Anderson appeared in the 1836 city directory as a freeman of color, working as a stone cutter, a skilled trade that hinted at education and training uncommon for someone of his background. He lived in a modest frame house on West 2nd Street, in a neighborhood where free black families clustered together for protection. His wife, recorded only as Sarah A., ran a small laundry business from their home, serving both white and black customers. What made Elijah Anderson unusual wasn't just his freedom or his trade. It was the quiet authority he commanded among Madison's black community. Men and women sought his counsel on matters from work disputes to family troubles. He could read and write with a fluency that surprised even educated whites who met him. And he possessed something else, harder to define, an ability to move between worlds, to speak the language of rivermen and merchants, to understand the complex web of laws and customs governing black life in a border state. But there was something about his past he never discussed. A shadow that followed him despite his free papers. Those closest to him noticed how he never spoke of his childhood, how he deflected questions about where he'd learned his trade, how his eyes hardened when conversation turned to the slave markets across the river in Kentucky. Some whispered that his free papers were forgeries, that he was a runaway who'd somehow obtained documentation. Others claimed he'd been freed by a guilty master's deathbed will. A few suggested something darker, that he'd purchased his freedom with money earned through means he'd rather not disclose. The truth, as would eventually emerge through fragments of testimony and coded letters, was more complex than any rumor. In the spring of 1839, a series of events began that would transform Elijah Anderson from a skilled tradesman into something far more dangerous, a man who would challenge the entire institution of slavery with methods so effective that slave owners across Kentucky would eventually offer a combined reward of $1,500 for his capture, dead or alive. It started with a knock on Anderson's door on a moonless night in April 1839. The temperature had dropped unexpectedly, and a cold rain fell steadily, turning Madison's unpaved streets to rivers of mud. Sarah answered to find a young black woman, no more than 17, soaked and shivering violently. Her dress was torn, her feet bare and bleeding, and her eyes held a terror that needed no explanation. "Please," the girl whispered, glancing over her shoulder at the dark street. "Mr. Anderson," they said. Mr. Anderson could help. Elijah appeared behind his wife, took one look at the girl, and pulled her inside without a word. He moved with practiced efficiency, as if he'd done this before, though no one in Madison had ever seen evidence of such activity. Sarah brought blankets and hot coffee, while Elijah examined the girl's feet, cut deeply from running through forest undergrowth. She'd crossed the river somehow, swimming in the dark, and made her way to Madison following directions she'd memorized, directions that included Elijah Anderson's name and address. The girl's name was Hannah. She'd escaped from a tobacco plantation 15 miles south of Louisville. Her master had recently died, and his son had decided to sell the estate's slaves to settle debts. Hannah had overheard herself being described to a slave trader from New Orleans, a man known for supplying the brutal sugar plantations of Louisiana. She'd been given a choice between a living death in the Deep South or taking her chances in the river. But what Hannah told the Andersons that night would have been unremarkable, another escape story among thousands, except for one detail that changed everything. She'd been given Anderson's name and address by another enslaved man on her plantation. A man who'd never left Kentucky, never been to Madison, yet who somehow knew exactly where Elijah Anderson lived and what he could do. "He said you'd know how to get me to Canada," Hannah explained, her voice barely a whisper. "He said you'd done it for others. He said you were the Moses of Kentucky, that you could lead people out of bondage." Elijah's face revealed nothing, but Sarah's sharp intake of breath suggested this wasn't the first time they'd heard such things. For a long moment, Anderson stared at the girl as if calculating risks and possibilities. Then he stood, walked to a small desk in the corner, and pulled out paper and a pencil. "Tell me everything you remember about the plantation," he said. "Every building, every road, every person who might have helped you. And tell me exactly what this man said to you. Word for word." What emerged over the next 2 hours was evidence of something that shouldn't have existed, a communication network among enslaved people across Kentucky. A system for passing information about escape routes and safe houses, a web of connections operating invisibly beneath plantation life. Hannah described how messages moved through a chain of trusted individuals, a field hand who delivered supplies to neighboring plantations, a blacksmith who traveled to repair tools, a preacher who held services for enslaved congregations, a laundress who collected and delivered clothing. Each person knew only the next link, never the full network, and each used coded language that sounded innocent to white ears but carried specific meanings to those who understood. And at the center, coordinating movements and providing resources, was Elijah Anderson, a man supposed to be just a stone cutter in a river town. The next morning, Hannah was gone. Neighbors who might have noticed anything unusual saw only Elijah Anderson leaving for work at dawn, carrying his tools as always. But 3 days later, a notice appeared in the Louisville Daily Journal, a $100 reward for the return of an escaped slave girl named Hannah, last seen near the Ohio River. The notice included a warning that anyone caught harboring or assisting the fugitive would be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. That same week, a letter arrived at Madison's mayor's office from a prominent Kentucky plantation owner named Thornton Gaines. Written in formal, legally threatening language, it demanded that Madison's authorities investigate certain free-colored residents suspected of enticing slaves to escape. Though no names were mentioned, everyone understood whom Gaines meant. The letter concluded with a barely veiled warning: if Madison continued to harbor those who interfered with property rights, Kentucky interests would take matters into their own hands. The letter was filed away, and officially, nothing was done. But in the careful balance of a border town depending on trade with both North and South, the warning was heard. Elijah Anderson had been noticed. And once noticed, he would never again operate in complete shadow. What no one in Madison knew, what wouldn't be discovered until years later when court testimonies were unsealed, was that Hannah wasn't the first person Anderson had helped, or the 10th, or even the 100th. By the spring of 1839, Elijah Anderson had already been operating his network for nearly 4 years, moving enslaved people from Kentucky plantations to freedom in Canada with a success rate that defied explanation. He developed methods that seemed impossible, forged free papers that could pass inspection, disguises that transformed field hands into traveling merchants, routes that avoided known slave catchers, and a network of safe houses stretching from the Kentucky interior to Detroit. But how had he built such a network? How did a stone cutter in Madison, Indiana, develop the resources, connections, and knowledge to orchestrate escapes across hundreds of miles? And perhaps most mysteriously, how did enslaved people in Kentucky, people who couldn't read, who'd never traveled beyond their plantations, who lived under constant surveillance, learn about Elijah Anderson and how to reach him? The answers lay buried in Anderson's past, in the years before he appeared in Madison, in a history he'd worked carefully to conceal. And as his network grew larger and more successful, as more enslaved people disappeared from Kentucky plantations, as rewards for his capture climbed higher, the pressure to uncover his secrets intensified. The investigation into Elijah Anderson's activities began quietly in the fall of 1839. It was initiated not by law enforcement, but by a private organization few knew existed, the Kentucky Association for the Protection of Property Rights. Formed 2 years earlier by a coalition of wealthy plantation owners frustrated with local authorities' ineffectiveness in stopping slave escapes, the association operated with substantial funds, employing private investigators, offering rewards, and maintaining a network of informants throughout the border states. Their interest in Anderson was sparked by a pattern their meticulous record-keeping had revealed. Over the previous 3 years, 47 enslaved people had disappeared from plantations in a specific region of north-central Kentucky, a cluster of counties including Jefferson, Shelby, Franklin, and Woodford. This wasn't unusual in itself. Escapes happened regularly along the border. What was unusual was that none of these 47 had been recaptured. Not one. In an era when most escaped slaves were caught within days, when professional slave catchers operated with brutal efficiency, a 100% success rate was statistically impossible. The association hired a man named Marcus Webb to investigate. Webb was a former Pinkerton agent who'd built a reputation tracking bank robbers and counterfeiters. He approached the slave escape problem with the same methodical analysis, collecting data, identifying patterns, and following evidence wherever it led. Webb's investigation file, later entered as evidence in Anderson's trial, revealed the depth of his findings. He'd interviewed plantation owners, questioned captured runaways from other networks, examined forged free papers, and traced the movements of known abolitionists. What emerged was a picture of an operation far more sophisticated than anyone had imagined. Anderson's network, Webb discovered, operated on multiple levels. The first level consisted of stations, safe houses where fugitives could hide. These weren't the homes of known abolitionists, which were watched, but residences of people with no apparent connection to anti-slavery activities, a German immigrant farmer who spoke little English, a widow who ran a boarding house, a merchant trading in agricultural supplies. Webb identified at least 15 such stations between central Kentucky and the Canadian border, but suspected there were many more. The second level was communication. Webb documented how information moved through the network using methods that left no written evidence, messages embedded in songs sung during work, in patterns of laundry hung out to dry, in arrangements of stones along certain roads, in encoded phrases used during church services. A hymn about crossing the River Jordan meant someone was planning an escape. A particular pattern of quilts on a clothesline indicated whether a safe house was secure. A stone cairn with an odd number of rocks marked a trail. The third level, and most crucial, was documentation. Every escaped slave needed free papers to travel safely through free states. Anderson had somehow obtained access to authentic free paper forms, possibly stolen from county clerks' offices, and had learned to forge signatures and seals so well that the documents appeared legitimate. Webb examined several sets of papers carried by captured fugitives and admitted they were nearly perfect. But the fourth level truly baffled Webb: the financial resources. Moving people hundreds of miles required money for food, clothing, transportation, bribes. Webb estimated the network must be spending at least $2,000 yearly, an enormous sum for a stone cutter earning perhaps $300 annually. Where was the money coming from? Webb's investigation led him to a surprising discovery: Elijah Anderson wasn't just helping slaves escape, he was running what amounted to a business. Wealthy free black families in the North, along with some white abolitionists, were paying Anderson to rescue specific individuals: family members sold south, spouses separated by sale, children torn from parents. Anderson charged fees based on difficulty, ranging from $50 to $500. He used this money to fund escapes for those who couldn't pay, creating a system where the wealthy subsidized the poor. This revelation transformed how authorities viewed Anderson. He wasn't just an idealistic abolitionist helping the occasional fugitive. He was operating a sophisticated, profit-generating enterprise that threatened slavery's economic foundation. If enslaved people knew they could be rescued for a price, if free black families could purchase escapes rather than accept permanent separation, if slavery could be undermined through organized resistance, then the institution itself was at risk. In December 1840, Marcus Webb submitted his final report to the Kentucky Association. It concluded with a recommendation: Elijah Anderson must be captured and prosecuted not just for helping fugitive slaves, but for conspiracy to deprive citizens of property, forgery, and operating a criminal enterprise across state lines. The association agreed and authorized Webb to coordinate with Kentucky law enforcement to build a case. But there was a problem. Anderson lived in Indiana, a free state where helping fugitive slaves wasn't a crime under state law. Federal fugitive slave laws existed but were difficult to enforce and required proof Anderson had physically entered Kentucky to entice escapes. Without such proof, Indiana authorities wouldn't cooperate. Webb needed evidence Anderson had crossed into Kentucky, made direct contact with enslaved people, and actively facilitated escapes. To get it, he'd need to infiltrate Anderson's network. Webb devised a simple but dangerous plan. He'd pose as a plantation owner's agent seeking to hire Anderson to rescue a specific enslaved woman, Webb's own supposed wife, sold south after their owner's death. Webb would offer to pay Anderson's fee, follow him into Kentucky if possible, and document his methods. If Anderson took the bait, Webb would have the evidence needed for prosecution. In February 1841, Marcus Webb, posing as a free black man named Samuel Wright, made contact with Elijah Anderson in Madison, Indiana. What happened during their meetings would remain disputed for years, with each man telling a different version. But the consequences would change everything, for Anderson and for the hundreds whose freedom depended on his network. Their meeting took place in a small church on Madison's west side, a congregation of free black residents where Anderson sometimes attended. Webb had spent weeks establishing his cover, renting a room, taking odd jobs, letting it be known through intermediaries that he sought help rescuing his wife from slavery. Anderson was cautious. He didn't approach Webb directly but sent intermediaries to ask questions, probe for inconsistencies, test whether he might be an informant. Webb had prepared well, creating a detailed backstory with names, dates, and locations that could be verified. He claimed his wife Martha had been sold to a plantation near Versailles, Kentucky, after their owner's death forced estate liquidation. He said he'd saved money to purchase her freedom, but the new owner refused to sell. He'd heard through friends in Cincinnati that a man in Madison might help. After 3 weeks of vetting, Anderson agreed to meet Webb personally. They sat in the church's back room on a cold March evening, a single candle providing light. Anderson's first words were a warning: if you're not who you say you are, if you're working for slave catchers or the association, you should know I've been threatened before. Men have tried to trap me, follow me, gather evidence against me. They've all failed. I'm still here, and the people I've helped are free in Canada. So if this is a game, leave now. Webb, maintaining his character, responded with the desperation of a man separated from his wife. He offered details about Martha, their life together, his determination to free her regardless of cost. He offered Anderson $300, a substantial sum suggesting both genuine need and resources. Anderson listened without expression, then asked a question revealing his operation's sophistication. "How do I know your wife wants to be rescued?" The question caught Webb off guard. He hadn't considered Anderson would care about the enslaved person's wishes. Most abolitionists assumed all enslaved people wanted freedom. But Anderson was asking something more nuanced. Did this specific woman want to risk her life? Did she know her husband was trying to rescue her? Had she agreed? Webb improvised, claiming he'd sent a message through a traveling preacher, that Martha knew and was waiting. Anderson seemed satisfied but imposed a condition. Before helping, he needed to verify Martha existed, was where Webb claimed, and genuinely wanted to escape. "I don't move people who don't want to be moved," Anderson explained. "I don't separate families unless they choose separation, and I don't risk my network on situations I haven't personally verified. If your wife is real and wants freedom, I'll help. But first, I need to confirm your story." This presented Webb with a dilemma. He'd invented Martha entirely. If Anderson investigated and found no one, Webb's cover would be blown. But if he backed out now, he'd lose his chance to gather evidence. Webb made a decision that would haunt him later. He told Anderson time was critical, that Martha's owner planned to sell her to a trader heading to New Orleans, that they had perhaps 2 weeks before she'd be moved beyond reach. He offered an additional $100 if Anderson could execute the rescue quickly without verification. Anderson refused. "I don't work that way. I've built this network by being careful, never taking unnecessary risks, verifying every detail. If your wife is about to be sold, we need to move quickly, but still carefully. Give me 1 week. I'll send someone to verify. If everything checks out, I'll have your wife in Madison within 2 weeks after that." Webb had no choice but to agree. He paid a $50 deposit and waited. What he didn't know was that Anderson had already suspected something wrong with Webb's story: small inconsistencies, subtle tells, questions designed to elicit specific information. Anderson had seen it before. He'd agreed to help not because he believed Webb, but because he wanted to know who had sent him. 3 days later, Anderson sent Webb a message. His contact in Kentucky had found Martha. She was indeed planning to be sold and eager to escape. Anderson requested the remaining $250 and said he'd have Martha in Madison within 10 days. Webb was confused. He'd invented Martha, she didn't exist. Yet Anderson claimed to have found her. Either Anderson was lying to extract payment, or something else was happening Webb didn't understand. He decided to pay and see what Anderson would deliver. What arrived in Madison 10 days later wasn't a woman named Martha. It was a young man named Thomas, escaped from a plantation near Versailles, carrying a message for Webb. Written on a small piece of paper were 3 sentences: "I know who you are. I know who sent you. If you want to understand what you're really fighting against, meet me at the place where you first lied to me." Webb realized he'd been outmaneuvered. Anderson had never believed his story, never intended to rescue a fictional wife, but had used Webb's deception to accomplish something else entirely: the escape of a real person who genuinely needed help. And now Anderson was offering Webb something unexpected, a chance to see the truth of what he'd been hired to destroy. Against his better judgment, against his professional training, against his employer's explicit instructions, Marcus Webb went to meet Elijah Anderson at the church where they'd first spoken. What Anderson told him would never be fully recorded, but its impact on Webb was profound and lasting. Years later, in a private letter discovered after his death, Webb wrote, "I went to that church intending to gather final evidence for Anderson's arrest. I left questioning everything I'd been hired to do. He didn't try to convert me to abolitionism or appeal to my morality. Instead, he showed me documents, letters from people he'd helped, testimonies from families reunited, records of children saved from being sold away from parents. Then he asked me a question I couldn't answer: How much would you pay to keep your family together? How far would you go to protect your children from being sold like livestock? I had no answer because I'd never faced such choices. My family was free, safe, protected by law. His question made me realize I was working to preserve a system that made such questions necessary. Webb didn't immediately abandon his investigation, but something had changed. He submitted a report documenting Anderson's methods but recommended against prosecution, arguing evidence was insufficient and an arrest might create public controversy. The association rejected his recommendation and hired a new investigator. But Webb had done something else during his infiltration, something he never reported. He documented the names and locations of Anderson's safe houses, the identities of his contacts, the routes, the communication methods. Instead of turning this over, Webb hid it, creating a detailed map of the entire network sealed in an envelope with instructions to destroy it unopened if anything happened to him. That envelope would resurface years later under unpredictable circumstances, its contents finally revealing the full scope of what Elijah Anderson had built, and the terrible price he would pay. By 1845, Elijah Anderson's network had grown beyond his original vision. What started as occasional help had evolved into a systematic operation moving an estimated 100 to 150 people yearly from slavery to freedom. Anderson had expanded safe houses, recruited new conductors, and developed more sophisticated methods for evading capture. But success brought danger. As more enslaved people disappeared, as financial losses mounted for slave owners, as Anderson's reputation spread, pressure to stop him intensified. The reward for his capture had grown to $1,500, enough to tempt even sympathizers. Anderson knew he was being hunted. He'd survived multiple capture attempts, including an 1843 incident where slave catchers crossed into Indiana to kidnap him from his home. Only the intervention of Madison's free black community, who surrounded his house armed with clubs and farming tools, prevented it. The incident created a diplomatic crisis between Indiana and Kentucky, with Kentucky's governor demanding Anderson's arrest for inciting violence and Indiana's governor refusing, noting Anderson was the victim of an illegal kidnapping attempt. The incident revealed something important: Anderson had allies in Madison willing to risk their safety to protect him. The free black community understood that if Anderson could be kidnapped with impunity, none were safe. White abolitionists, including prominent Quaker families, began providing financial support and legal assistance. Anderson was no longer operating alone, he'd become the center of a broader resistance movement. But visibility came with costs. Anderson's wife, Sarah, grew increasingly fearful. They received threatening letters, found property vandalized, endured constant surveillance from suspicious neighbors and visiting Kentuckians. In 1844, Sarah gave birth to their first child, a daughter named Mary, and protecting his family weighed heavily on Anderson. In spring 1846, Anderson made a fateful decision to expand operations directly into Kentucky, establishing safe houses south of the Ohio River where fugitives could hide before crossing. This was an enormous risk. If caught in Kentucky, Anderson would be subject to that state's severe penalties for helping enslaved people escape. Anderson recruited a network of contacts in Kentucky, free black people, sympathetic poor whites, even a few enslaved people willing to risk punishment to help others. He began making regular trips across the river, sometimes disguised as a traveling merchant, sometimes as a laborer seeking work, sometimes moving at night through memorized forests and back roads. It was during one such trip in July 1846 that Anderson encountered a situation testing everything he'd built. He'd been contacted by a free black minister in Lexington named Reverend James Harper, who'd received a desperate plea from a woman named Elizabeth. Enslaved on a large plantation near Frankfort, Elizabeth, with her 3 children, was scheduled for auction in 2 weeks after her owner's death. Elizabeth's husband had been sold to Mississippi 3 years earlier. She'd never see him again. But she was determined her children wouldn't suffer the same fate. She wanted Anderson to help them escape before the auction. The situation was complicated. The plantation was heavily guarded, aware enslaved people might try to escape before a sale, Elizabeth's children were young, 5, 7, and 9, making travel difficult. The auction was heavily advertised, drawing slave traders from across the South, making Frankfort dangerous for any black person without ironclad documentation. Anderson spent 3 days surveying the plantation, studying guard routines, identifying escape routes, contacting Elizabeth through intermediaries. He discovered a successful escape would require something he'd never attempted: removing 4 people simultaneously from a guarded plantation, moving them through hostile territory with children, within a narrow time frame before the auction. The plan Anderson devised was audacious. On the night before the auction, when guards would be most relaxed, Anderson would create a diversion on one side while Elizabeth and her children slipped away from the other. They'd travel to a safe house 5 miles away, hide during the day, then move at night through a series of stations to the Ohio River. Anderson arranged for a boat at a specific location, manned by a German immigrant who asked no questions and accepted payment in advance. The escape was set for August 12, 1846. Anderson crossed into Kentucky 3 days earlier, moving between safe houses, finalizing arrangements. Everything was in place, diversion planned, route clear, boat ready. But on August 11, something went wrong. One of Anderson's contacts in Frankfort, a free black stable hand, was arrested on suspicion of helping slaves escape. Under brutal interrogation, he revealed something was planned for the plantation near Frankfort. Though he didn't know details, authorities increased security at all plantations with scheduled auctions. Anderson learned of the arrest through his network, but by then it was too late to call off the escape. Elizabeth and her children were expecting him. They'd already made preparations, saying goodbyes, gathering possessions. If Anderson didn't come, they'd be sold at auction the next day, scattered to different buyers, their family destroyed forever. Anderson made a choice revealing his commitment's depth. He decided to proceed despite increased danger but modified the plan. Instead of a diversion, which might be expected, he'd rely on stealth and timing. Instead of the planned route, which might be watched, he'd take Elizabeth and her children through a more dangerous path, directly through Frankfort itself, hiding in plain sight among auction crowds. On August 12, Elijah Anderson entered the plantation near Frankfort. What happened over the next 12 hours became legend, with multiple versions differing in details but agreeing on essential facts. Anderson successfully removed Elizabeth and her 3 children, moved them through Frankfort during auction day chaos, and transported them across the Ohio River to freedom. But the escape came at a cost. During the journey through Frankfort, Anderson was spotted by a slave trader who recognized him from wanted posters. The trader alerted authorities, and a pursuit began. Anderson evaded capture long enough to get Elizabeth and her children to the river and onto the waiting boat. But in doing so, he revealed his face, methods, and presence in Kentucky to dozens of witnesses. For the first time, Elijah Anderson had been positively identified operating in Kentucky. Warrants were issued, his description circulated, and the Kentucky Association finally had evidence to pursue him across state lines. Anderson made it back to Madison but knew his situation had changed fundamentally. He could no longer operate with relative anonymity. His face was known, his methods understood, powerful forces determined to stop him. Allies urged him to flee to Canada, abandon his network, save himself. But Anderson refused. "If I run," he told supporters, "the network collapses. Hundreds depend on the routes we've established, contacts we've made, safe houses we've built. If I disappear, all disappears with me. I didn't start this work to save myself. I started it to save others. And that work isn't finished." What Anderson didn't know was that his enemies had set in motion a plan finally bringing him down, a plan exploiting the one vulnerability he'd never fully protected against: betrayal from within his network. The betrayal came from an unexpected source. In October 1850, Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act, requiring citizens of free states to assist in capturing escaped slaves and imposing severe penalties on helpers. The law transformed the Underground Railroad landscape, making previously safe territories dangerous and forcing conductors like Anderson to develop new methods. but it also created opportunities for those willing to profit from betrayal. Rewards increased, legal risks became severe enough that some former supporters withdrew. One of Anderson's contacts in southern Indiana, a farmer named William Groves who'd operated a safe house for 3 years, found himself in financial trouble in early 1851. Crops failed, he owed creditors, faced losing his farm. When a Kentucky slave catcher named Thomas Stevens offered $500 for information about Anderson's network, Groves struggled with conscience for weeks before agreeing. Groves didn't provide information directly about Anderson, too obvious. Instead, he revealed locations of several Indiana safe houses and names of other conductors. Stevens used this to set up surveillance, watching safe houses, tracking fugitives and conductors. Over months, Stevens built a detailed picture of Anderson's network. In August 1851, Stevens learned Anderson planned a major operation, rescuing 17 enslaved people from a Bourbon County, Kentucky plantation. The group included entire families threatened with sale and separation, the largest single rescue Anderson had ever attempted, requiring coordination among multiple conductors, several safe houses, careful timing. Stevens saw an opportunity. If he could catch Anderson in Kentucky with 17 fugitive slaves, evidence would be overwhelming. Anderson could be prosecuted under Kentucky law, convicted, imprisoned, ending his network. Stevens coordinated with Kentucky authorities and slave catchers, setting a trap. The rescue was planned for September 20, 1851. Anderson crossed into Kentucky with 2 other conductors, intending to move the 17 in 3 groups along different routes to minimize risk. But Stevens positioned men along all likely routes, waiting for Anderson to reveal himself. The trap sprung near Paris, Kentucky, as Anderson's group moved through woods toward a safe house. Stevens and 6 others, including local law enforcement, surrounded them. Anderson tried to flee but was captured after a brief chase. The 17 fugitives were captured and returned. Anderson was taken to Bourbon County Jail in Paris, charged with multiple counts of slave stealing, conspiracy, violating Kentucky law, charges carrying potential sentences over 40 years. His trial was scheduled for November 1851. News of Anderson's capture spread through abolitionist networks. Supporters in Indiana and Ohio raised money for his defense. Northern newspapers published articles portraying him as a hero fighting an unjust system. But in Kentucky, public opinion was firmly against him, a criminal who stole valuable property and encouraged slave rebellion. Anderson's trial lasted 3 days. Prosecution presented overwhelming evidence, testimony from slave owners whose property disappeared, from the 17 captured fugitives confirming Anderson helped them, from William Groves about the network's operations, from Thomas Stevens about Anderson's Kentucky activities. Anderson's defense attorney, a young Cincinnati lawyer named Robert Hayes volunteering for the case, argued Anderson acted from moral conviction, the laws violated were unjust, helping people escape slavery was humanitarian, not criminal. The jury, all white Kentucky men, many slave owners, deliberated less than 2 hours before returning guilty on all counts. At sentencing November 18, 1851, Anderson spoke. His words were recorded by a court stenographer and later published in Northern abolitionist newspapers. "I stand convicted of crimes against Kentucky's laws. But I am guilty of no crime against God's laws or humanity's principles. I have helped men, women, children escape bondage. I have reunited families torn apart by sale. I have given hope to people with no hope. If these actions are crimes in Kentucky, I am proud to be a criminal. But I believe history will judge me more kindly than this court. I believe future generations will look back and ask not why I did what I did, but why anyone thought it wrong." The judge, unmoved, sentenced Anderson to 20 years in Kentucky State Penitentiary in Frankfort. Anderson was 41. If he served fully, he'd be 61 upon release, if he survived. Anderson transferred to the penitentiary December 1851. The prison was brutal, inmates worked long hours in harsh conditions, disease common, discipline enforced through physical punishment. Anderson worked in the prison's hemp factory, processing raw hemp into rope and cloth, breathing toxic dust, working dangerous machinery. For his first few imprisoned years, Anderson maintained hope. He received letters from supporters, learned Sarah and Mary were safe in Madison, heard his network, though damaged, still operated under new leadership. But as years passed, health deteriorating from harsh conditions, possibility of pardon fading, hope dimmed. In 1856, Anderson developed a persistent cough diagnosed as consumption, tuberculosis. Common in the overcrowded, poorly ventilated prison, treatment minimal. His health declined rapidly over following months. By summer 1857, too weak to work, confined to the prison hospital ward. During these final months, something strange began, fueling speculation and mystery for generations. Anderson began receiving visits from people who shouldn't have had access, free black people from Frankfurt, white abolitionists from the North, even, some accounts say, formerly enslaved people he'd helped years earlier. How visitors gained access to a maximum security prisoner was never explained. Prison records are incomplete, pages missing from visitor logs. What discussed never recorded. But guards witnessing meetings reported Anderson seemed to give instructions, share information, coordinate activities from his deathbed. One guard later testified seeing Anderson hand a small package to a visitor, though couldn't say what it contained. On October 30, 1857, Elijah Anderson died in Kentucky State Penitentiary. He was 47. Official cause, consumption, certainly true. But 3 guards on duty reported strange circumstances. According to accounts, Anderson unconscious most previous day, barely breathing, near death. Around midnight, suddenly awakened, alert, lucid. Asked for water, drank slowly, spoke to guards in a clear, strong voice impossible for a dying man. One guard reported Anderson said, "Tell them the map is complete. Tell them the routes are marked. Tell them the work continues." Guards had no idea what meant but disturbed by sudden lucidity, intensity of gaze. Then, just as suddenly, Anderson closed eyes, stopped breathing. Died without struggle, without pain, as if decided it was time. Prison warden Charles Whitfield ordered Anderson's body buried immediately within 6 hours. No autopsy, no family notified, no public announcement. Anderson buried in an unmarked grave in the prison cemetery, location never recorded officially. Why the rush? Why secrecy? Warden Whitfield never explained, but years later a letter he'd written to the Kentucky Association was discovered in private archives. Dated November 1, 1857, it contained, "The prisoner Anderson is dead and buried. I have followed your instructions regarding disposal of the body and destruction of certain materials found in his cell. The matter is concluded." What materials found? What instructions? Why burial secret? Questions unanswered for decades until Marcus Webb's sealed envelope revealed truth. The envelope surfaced in 1889, 32 years after Anderson's death, when Marcus Webb's estate settled after his death in Chicago. Webb had become a successful businessman after leaving investigation. Personal papers included the sealed envelope created in 1841 with instructions open only after death. Webb's executor, following instructions, opened it, found 2 documents inside. First, the detailed map of Anderson's network Webb created during infiltration, showing safe houses, routes, contacts, methods from Kentucky to Canada. Second, a letter Webb wrote explaining why hidden, not turned over. In it, Webb described meeting Anderson in 1841, questions asked, perspective-changing realization. But also contained information discovered years later, explaining mystery of Anderson's final days, secrecy surrounding burial. According to Webb's letter, Anderson spent prison years doing something remarkable, documenting his entire network, creating a comprehensive guide allowing others to continue his work. Using smuggled paper and ink, working secretly during rare private moments, Anderson drew maps, wrote instructions, recorded names and locations of every contact. Created an underground railroad manual, everything learned during 15 years of operations. Anderson knew he was dying, knew he wouldn't leave prison alive, but determined his network wouldn't die with him. Visitors in final months were couriers, collecting manual pieces, smuggling out, distributing to conductors throughout North. The package handed to a visitor, witnessed by guard, was the final section, most sensitive information, including locations of still operational Kentucky safe houses. When Anderson died, prison authorities searched his cell, found evidence of documentation, hidden papers, crude maps on cloth scraps, coded notes. Warden Whitfield, under Kentucky Association pressure, ordered everything destroyed. Anderson buried quickly to prevent grave becoming abolitionist rallying point. But too late. Anderson's manual already circulated, used by conductors throughout the Underground Railroad. Information preserved during imprisonment helped hundreds more escape slavery in years leading to Civil War. Webb's letter concluded reflecting on Anderson's legacy. I was hired to destroy Elijah Anderson's network. Instead, I witnessed creation of something that couldn't be destroyed, an idea, a method, proof organized resistance could challenge even most entrenched oppression systems. Anderson died in prison, but his work survived. And in surviving, helped bring about end of the very institution he fought against. Discovery of Webb's envelope in 1889 sparked renewed interest. Historians researched Anderson's life, interviewed people who knew him, tracked down formerly enslaved, helped. Emerged, a man whose impact far greater than realized. Estimates of people helped vary, most historians agree, between 1,000 and 1,500, extraordinary for a single conductor. Network operated approximately 16 years, 1835 to 1851, maintained unmatched success rate. But perhaps Anderson's greatest legacy wasn't number saved, it was system created. Communication methods, network structure, forged documents, verification procedures became models for other conductors. Manual created in prison copied, distributed, influencing Underground Railroad operations throughout North. After Civil War ended slavery 1865, many Anderson helped shared stories. Described careful planning, personal courage, unwavering commitment to freedom. Told how risked life repeatedly, used own money when necessary, treated every person helped with dignity, respect. Anderson's wife Sarah lived until 1892, long enough to see husband's story finally told. Interviewed at 78, asked what wanted remembered about Elijah, answered simply, he believed every person deserved to be free. Willing to sacrifice everything to make that belief real. Didn't do it for glory or recognition. Did it because right. And never stopped, even when cost freedom, eventually life. Location of Anderson's grave remains unknown. Prison cemetery later relocated, grave location records lost. But 1920, Madison, Indiana, erected a small monument in cemetery where Sarah and daughter buried. Inscription, Elijah Anderson, 1810 to 1857, the Moses of Kentucky. He led his people to freedom. Today, historians continue uncovering new information about Anderson's network, methods. Documents surface occasionally in archives, letters discovered in old houses, descendants share family stories. Each discovery adds understanding of how one man born into slavery created a system challenging entire institution. But mysteries remain, how first learned skills needed. Where initial funding. How contacted enslaved deep in Kentucky interior. What happened to complete manual version, document containing all methods, knowledge. May never fully answered, perhaps appropriate for a man operating in shadows, keeping secrets, protecting people depending on him. Anderson's greatest skill, knowing what information to reveal, what keep hidden, understanding some secrets needed protection even after death. What known, Elijah Anderson existed, helped hundreds escape slavery, built network operating remarkably effectively, died in prison still trying to continue work. These facts alone make story worth remembering, not legend or myth, but historical reality demonstrating what one person, armed with courage, conviction, can accomplish against overwhelming odds. True story of the Moses of Kentucky isn't just escapes, rescues. About power of organized resistance, importance of systematic thinking against injustice, reality change often comes not grand gestures but patient, dangerous daily work of people willing risk everything for believed right. Elijah Anderson, such a person. Though died unmarked grave, story suppressed generations, powerful forces tried erasing legacy, succeeded only way truly matters, people saved lived free, raised families in freedom, passed down stories of men who made freedom possible. In end, only monument matters, not stone or bronze, but living memory carried forward by those lives changed by one man's refusal accept some people meant enslaved.